Welcome back. In this video about sentence structure, we're going to focus on the technique of repetition. Now, as always with sentence structure techniques, it's very important to be aware that sentence structure is just an umbrella term. It incorporates lots of different techniques, and we have to be careful that we're aware of that at all times. So we're going to focus in on repetition. Repetition, repetition, repetition. So hopefully that will help you remember the technique. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So just saying something, the same thing, more than once. That's what repetition is. When you're answering a question, you'll use this structure. The writer uses repetition. You'll remember, we're never going to say the writer uses sentence structure. The writer uses repetition too. And we'll look at some examples to see how we'll finish our answer in a moment. I use this example to help me remember how repetition works. When I was in school, not so much nowadays, but many years ago, it was quite common for teachers to give you lines as punishment. So something like, I will not forget my homework again, I will not forget my homework again, etc., etc. The idea there is that the teachers believed that by making us repeat something, dozens if not hundreds of times, we'd eventually remember. Now in practice, repetition only is effective if you do it, once or twice. Doing it 200 or 300 times, actually it loses the effect and it didn't stop the behavior the teachers were trying to change. So writers now use repetition kind of much more cleverly. There's no point in writing a whole page of repetition like that. It becomes very stulted and boring. Why do writers use repetition? Well, it comes down to this simple fact. They want to draw your attention to a part of their text that's important for their argument. Now, think about it like this. Most of the articles we read for the SQA close reading exams and prelims, they're usually adapted from newspaper articles. And a lot of newspapers don't print in colour, and they didn't for years. So in order to highlight something, if you can't use colour, so if you can't use a highlighter, like we would use if we were studying, one of the ways to highlight an important point is to use any technique, and repetition is one of those techniques. So it draws the reader's attention to this particular part of the argument, and it makes the argument stronger. So, by using repetition, the writer is saying, please pay attention to this word or this phrase, as it's an important part of my argument. So, let's look at some examples. What does repetition look like in practice? Here's the first passage. I'll read it out. There can be no doubting the popularity of the World Cup. As a global event, it is probably only matched by the Olympics. The World Cup final was watched by over 500 million people. 500 million people! Let that sink in for a minute. That's a lot of pressure on a player taking a spot kick in a penalty shootout. Now, can you see the repetition? If you don't see it straight away, pause the video until you do. Take your time, there's no rush. And here it is. Okay, so I just put it in bold. 500 million people, 500 million people. So I'm able to put it in bold, but writers and newspapers don't always have that option, so they use things like repetition. So what is this phrase being repeated? What's it doing? Okay, well, a question about this passage might look something like this. Look at lines 1 to 8. Explain how one example of the writer's use of sentence structure makes it clear that the World Cup is popular. Okay, so we go back to our passage. How is that 500 million people showing that the World Cup final is popular? Well, it's to do with quantity, isn't it? It's to do with the amount of people that are watching it. There's a lot more people watching that match than most football matches that take place in the world every day. So, for our first mark, we just write the writer uses repetition in line 5. Just identifying the repetition gets us 50% of the marks, which is great. And I quote it as well, just to be sure that I'm making it clear to the marker that I know which part has been repeated. So the writer uses repetition in line 5, 500 million people, to highlight that an incredibly large number of people were watching that particular football match, emphasizing how popular it is. And there's my second mark. Okay, so 1 mark for the top line and the second mark for the next 4 lines afterwards. Let's look at a second example. Now the repetition in this example is going to be a little bit trickier to spot. So again, pause the video and take your time to find it if you wish. There can be no doubting the popularity of the World Cup. As a global event, it is probably only matched by the Olympics. The World Cup final is watched by men and women of all ages. It is watched by children. It is watched by people who never normally watch football. For 90 minutes, it unites our planet through a mixture of passion, competition, and curiosity. Okay, So pause the video if you haven't seen the repetition yet. And there it is watched by. Now this is a different type of repetition. It's kind of spaced out a little bit more. So here it is a phrase or an expression that's been repeated 3 times. So the question will be quite similar. Look at lines 1 to 9. Explain how one example of the writer's use of sentence structure makes it clear that the World Cup is popular. We've spotted the repetition. We believe it helps show that the World Cup is popular. So we use the formula. The writer uses repetition in lines 4 to 6. So this time it's a bigger line reference because it's spread more throughout the passage. I quote the phrase. Repeating the phrase is watched by, so that I'm sure the marker knows which phrase I'm talking about. To highlight the huge variety of people that tune in for the World Cup final, emphasizing how popular it is. So in the first example, it was all about quantity. 500 million people. 500 million people was about the amount, the number of people that were watching it. This repetition, this example, is watched by men and women, is watched by children, is watched by people who don't normally watch football. It actually focuses in on the idea of variety. That there's lots of different types of people watch the World Cup final. Okay, and that's second mark. That's the second mark there. So 1 mark for the first line, 2nd mark for the next 4 lines below it. And that's basically how all techniques work in sentence structure. Repetition is the writer shining a light for you, saying, please look more carefully at this part of my argument. Okay, if it was, say, naming a star, okay, in the night sky, by naming it and repeating it and repeating it and repeating it, it draws your attention to that star. Or a planet, right? If you repeat the word Mars, 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 you'd be drawn in the direction of that planet. It works really, really, really well. You should use it in your own writing as well for your folios. And if you remember this fact that repetition is simply asking you to pay more attention to a certain part of the argument, then this question becomes a lot easier to answer. So what's the formula? Identify the repetition. So you'll either be quoting a word or maybe a phrase, or a whole sentence can be repeated. And then explain why the writer repeated those words or the phrase or the sentence. Always focusing your answer on the question. So in our question in our 2 examples was about popularity, so we made sure our answer was focused in that direction. And that's it for all repetition questions. Just bearing in mind that you'll have a lot longer passage to look at when you're looking for repetition in the prelims and in the exams. Although you won't be asked to look at the whole passage, you'll probably just be asked to look at a paragraph, 5 or 6 lines, something like that. And hopefully you'll be able to pick out repetition now. Remembering though that it will be in the sentence structure question where you get asked about repetition, and that there are loads of other techniques available too. So sentence structure is not a technique. I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record. I'm repeating this maybe too much myself, but I want to make sure you don't make the mistake that I see too often. So you'll use this format. The writer uses repetition too, and then give your example of repetition. Okay, that's it for repetition. Thanks very much for watching this video, and we'll move on to the next technique in the next video. See you there.